Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, April 29th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Georgia yet again. This morning I made a video talking about the Senate election in the state of Georgia, and it looks like we're going to go 2 for 2 today, talking about the state of Georgia. Now, this race is not going to be focused on the Senate election, but rather the governor election, and more specifically, the Republican primary that we have been seeing really exhibited in this state. The Georgia governor's race is extremely competitive in the general election, but the Republican primary seems to be getting further and further away from David Perdue as a viable winner for this primary. Taking a look at when it occurs, May 24th, 2022, we have just under a month until the actual primary election actually happens, which means there's very little time for comeback for David Perdue in this race. Now, David Perdue has been endorsed all the way back to December of 2021 by President Donald Trump, and from there, that really skyrocketed his campaign. At one point, there was even a tie between the two immediately following Trump's announcement of his endorsement. But as time went on, we started to see Brian Kemp begin to build a lead. He was up by 7 points, then 9 points, then 11 points, and now more recently he's up by 24 points, 25 points, and 26 points. Essentially, Brian Kemp is really rising in level of popularity across the Republican primary voters, and despite President Trump making an endorsement months prior to the nomination process to the actual eventual primary, David Perdue is unable to defeat Brian Kemp. Now, it comes at a bit of a surprise because in 2018, Brian Kemp was actually not the Republican frontrunner for governor in this state. If you take a look at the electoral history in the state of Georgia in 2018, you will actually find that that governor election was not meant to go to Brian Kemp. Instead, it was meant to go to Casey Cagle, the incumbent lieutenant governor of the time. He had received the endorsement from Nathan Deal, Saxby Chambliss, representatives across the state, and a bunch of state senators. If you take a look at Brian Kemp's endorsements in the initial pre-runoff round, there were none. And there were none for a reason. He was Secretary of State, but it was very much seen as just a political opportunity for Brian Kemp. He didn't want to be lieutenant governor, he wanted to be governor. And he wasn't polling that well. At some point, actually, he was defeated by Hunter Hill in some of these polls, but eventually made it into the Republican primary first round results with about 25.51% of the results. Casey Cagle, on the other hand, received 39% of the vote. And it seemed all but certain that Casey Cagle was going to eventually win. If you take a look at what happened in the runoff election, you found that very early on, Casey Cagle had leads. They weren't super substantial, but looking at the preliminary runoff results, you essentially knew that Casey Cagle was in the lead, and that's really what it told us. But then came a turning point. President Trump made an endorsement for Brian Kemp on July 18th, 2018. In fact, Donald Trump made this endorsement through Twitter. He used a very simple social media platform to make an endorsement for Brian Kemp, and the runoff election occurred on July 24th. Now, Brian Kemp did start maintaining a lead as time went on, but it was very interesting to see that the endorsement for Brian Kemp practically guided this direction in Brian Kemp's eventual victory. If you take a look at the results, it doesn't make sense that Casey Cagle received less votes, raw votes, than the first round. It makes sense percentage-wise because President Trump is a very well-known figure and his endorsement does carry a lot of weight, but for Casey Cagle to drop nearly 100,000 votes across the state, at least over 50,000 votes, not almost 100,000, but somewhere in the middle there, you're finding that it was a super significant drop-off, and that Brian Kemp's rise from 155,000 to 408,000 votes didn't happen overnight and happened largely due to President Trump's endorsement. Now, some could argue that Brian Kemp would have made it anyway, but it seemingly, and very much based off the polls, was a lot more difficult for Brian Kemp to actually start to build up that lead. While he could have won the primary runoff election, in no way would have anyone expected him to win with 70% of the vote across the state against the incumbent lieutenant governor. Casey Cagle, again, has gone back looking at the election results and said that he lost because of the Trump endorsement, and I very much stand by that. Looking at the governor's race this time around, we're not seeing that occur. And considering that the endorsement for Brian Kemp came just 6 days before the runoff election, tells me that that endorsement probably could have done a lot more damage in the first round had that endorsement came through. But what we're looking at now is that the endorsement not only came right before the first round, came 6 months prior to the first round. If you take a look at when this endorsement came for Donald Trump, you're looking at December 6th, 2021. Trump endorses David Perdue in Georgia's governor race. It was a very big announcement, and I can tell you right now that Brian Kemp probably was very scared. If you take a look at the endorsements that Brian Kemp has, he doesn't even have as many that Casey Cagle had leading into the first round in 2018, and that's pretty substantial. I mean, what you're finding is that he has the endorsement, sure, of Lieutenant Governor and Attorney General of Georgia. Makes sense considering that these two are under his official designation, a part of his administration, but the only governors you have are Chris Christie. Why would you even want his endorsement in this case? He's not from Georgia. You take a look at the municipal officials, okay, you have 2 mayors, but are they notable mayors? The answer is no. You do have the RGA because they always back their incumbents regardless if Donald Trump has made a different decision. Same thing with the NRSC and the NRCC and the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. But on the other hand, David Perdue has that super big name, Donald Trump. Herschel Walker has refused to endorse, but truly it doesn't matter about Herschel Walker's endorsement. The endorsement that mattered was President Trump's. And you saw that following President Trump's endorsement, even when there was speculation that Brian Kemp was going to run, eventually once that endorsement came in, it started to rise. And then it ended up dissipating, ended up plateauing. And now we're at a point where Brian Kemp is no longer in a competitive position with David Perdue, averaging about a 15-point lead. And based off the 3 most recent polls, an A-rated pollster from Survey USA, you have Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Landmark, you find Brian Kemp up by 24, up by 25, and up by 26. So this incumbency factor seems to be a very big deal, but it also is a testament to Brian Kemp's resilience and also Donald Trump's inability to sway Republican voters to the extent that we previously thought. You know, looking at primary elections during Trump's administration when he was in his term, you found that the endorsement really held a very big weight. You know, that Donald Trump campaigning for a candidate in a primary was certainly the seal of approval and essentially locked that candidate in for winning the nomination. And it was true in 2020 as well when you looked at some of those more competitive Republican primaries. When President Trump made an endorsement, that was the end-all be-all. And looking at 2022, there are many states actually, where Donald Trump's endorsement has definitely been persuasive. But the question is it enough? It used to be enough in every single state. That is no longer the case. So when I see that David Perdue is barely defeating catching up to Brian Kemp, in fact, not at all at this point, it tells me that Trump's endorsement doesn't hold the weight that he thinks it does. I mean, Donald Trump literally spent the entirety of his lame duck months attacking governors Brian Kemp and from Doug Ducey, Arizona. Those two were the targets of President Trump's big lie. And the reason being that they went after him because they certified the election results. They didn't count the ballots. They didn't set the election rules. Maybe for the case of Brian Kemp as Secretary of State. But, what you found was that they were not directly responsible for the results. Only Donald Trump and Joe Biden were, because it was their election. All Brian Kemp did was certify them, as every single governor did. But Donald Trump didn't like that. He said Georgia was rigged. He said Arizona was rigged, and he expected these 2 Republicans to back him. And when they didn't back him, he went all out. He attacked Brian Kemp, went to a campaign rally saying, wouldn't it even be, better for you guys to have Stacey Abrams because at least she isn't hiding it like Brian Kemp is. Essentially saying that Brian Kemp is worse for Georgia because he's acting like a Republican. He calls him a rhino, a Republican in name only. And that type of rhetoric has been very hurtful to Brian Kemp's image. I mean, looking at his approval rating, it started to dissipate tremendously amongst Republicans. But when it comes down to the issue of who wins the primary, Brian Kemp still maintains his lead. Looking at election polls beyond the primaries, I see why Brian Kemp is the favorite. I don't know how many Georgia voters are actually looking at the election data, but it is something to be said that Brian Kemp is by far the more electable potential nominee. For instance, in the most recent poll from Survey USA, Kemp is up by 5. Perdue is only up by 3. Within the margin of error for Perdue, not for Brian Kemp. Another poll here. Signal, you find that Brian Kemp beats Stacey Abrams by 6, but Stacey Abrams beats David Perdue by 1. That's a 7-point difference. Emerson College, also sponsored by The Hill, Brian Kemp defeats Stacey Abrams by 8, Perdue only by 5. Wick polls here shows that Kemp is up by 6, Perdue by 3. Quinnipiac shows Kemp up by 2, Perdue and Abrams tied. The University of Georgia, Kemp up by 7, Perdue up by 4. If you take a look further and further, you find that even in some cases, for instance, Redfield shows Vernon Jones losing by 5, Brian Kemp winning by 3. You find other polls from way earlier back in 2021. You find that the University of Nevada did poll shows Kemp up by 5, Doug Collins up by 2, Herschel Walker up. Not Herschel Walker. The other Walker that's was potentially, or maybe it was Herschel Walker. I just remember that there was a potential, I guess it was Herschel Walker, but only up by 1. Very interesting to see that what you were looking at here was that the governor's race in Georgia very clearly favors Brian Kemp more than it favors any other Republican, and not by a marginal amount. So I think there are voters out there that realize that Brian Kemp as the incumbent is more electable. He proved himself in 2018, despite it being a very big year for the Democratic Party. And I understand that Georgia was a lot redder then than it was in 2020, than it is right now. But the national environment was not on the side of the GOP. And some states went blue, whereas Georgia did not. For instance, Pennsylvania went to Democrats by 16 points. Michigan by 10. Wisconsin narrowly, but didn't. Kansas flipped to the Democratic Party. Maine flipped to the Democratic Party. Illinois flipped. New Mexico flipped. Nevada flipped. You saw many, many states flip from red to blue, but Georgia did not. And I'm sure that people recognize that Brian Kemp and his ability to take down Stacey Abrams when Donald Trump couldn't combat her efforts in the state of Georgia tells them that Brian Kemp is the way to go. I also think there is a question here. Why is David Perdue actually running? Realistically, does he have an open seat? No. Realistically, did he win his last election? No. He does not provide anything to the Republican Party in the state of Georgia. Looking at his election, there's a reason why people don't want him to be here. He is only running because he knows that Trump would endorse him. And that was a promise that was already set out. David Perdue is looking for political opportunities. The Georgia governor election, actually, surprisingly enough, is not the first race that he entered into this election cycle. You don't believe me? Take a look at the Senate election back in early 2021. Those who removed themselves from the race, guess who? David Perdue, who initially filed paperwork, meaning that he was getting ready and geared up, in fact, ready to declare his bid for Senate. This isn't the race he lost, by the way. You're talking about a completely separate race against a completely separate Democrat. But at this point, Donald Trump told him, if you run, I'm not going to endorse him. I'm going to endorse Herschel Walker. So what he did was he said, okay, David Perdue walked back and said, okay, well, I was looking for an opportunity to get back in the Senate. Instead, I'm going to run for governor. And Donald Trump said, okay, I will endorse you. And that's exactly what happened. It was a maneuvering of David Perdue's part. I think also partially that he did it to get the endorsement from President Trump. I also don't know if there was a guarantee that David Perdue would have even ran for governor had he not ran for Senate. Because had he not been coerced by President Trump, or rather maybe David Perdue coerced Donald Trump into getting such an endorsement, I think at the end of the day, what happened with him running for Senate allowed him to enter into the governorship. Because realistically, Herschel Walker might not have beaten David Perdue in a Senate primary. Because people knew David Perdue for the Senate, and they knew Brian Kemp for the governor's race. And if anyone was to act as a pre-existing incumbent, it probably would be the guy who served in the Senate just a year prior to the Republican primary for the senatorial primary in the state of Georgia. So maybe Donald Trump also thought that David Perdue could potentially be a threat to Herschel Walker. So he removed him out of the race through a graceful endorsement that doesn't look like it's actually giving David Perdue the bump that you might otherwise think. Almost all pundits now agree that the Republican primary has turned tides. What started out as being an exceptionally close race that went into a larger lead for Brian Kemp, but still surmountable for David Perdue, and it looked like it was heading to a runoff, it does not look like it's going to head to a runoff. It looks like, based off the 3 most recent polls, and based off of the near average, that Brian Kemp is going to get above 50% of the vote, and that is going to allow him to win outright. That runoff election only occurs if all candidates get less than 50%, considering that this is truly now a two-way race between Brian Kemp and David Perdue. It is going to be very difficult to see how this primary heads to a runoff. And even in a runoff election, based off the numbers I am seeing right now, I would not be super confident that that David Perdue wins. I think that it gives him more time to try to milk the Trump endorsement, but it's been 6 months thus far. and 6 months is resulting in just 1/3 of the vote. To remind you, President Trump's endorsement is impactful. It does matter, but maybe not to the extent that we originally thought. I think this will be a true testament and a true test to whether or not President Trump's attackings, whether or not President Trump's influence and endorsement holds the weight even to a high degree, especially in a state that used to adore him amongst the Republican Party. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.